Hello everyone, this is another little mini lecture I wanted to do for you. The topic of this one is called Comparative Advantage, and it relates to the underlying principle in economics that you've looked at, we've studied a little bit already, that trade makes everybody better off. And we want to understand why that is the case. Trade does make everybody better off. Why does that happen? And the idea is nothing new in economics. This goes back a long time. In fact, Adam Smith, in his book Wealth of Nations, talked about the fact that when people specialize in what they do best and then trade for other products or trade for things that other people do best, everyone winds up better off. And this whole idea applies at all levels. It applies to trade between people, trade between countries, etc. This gentleman over here is David Ricardo, and a little more recently he's attributed with coming up with the idea of comparative advantage, formalizing this idea a little bit more. So we want to talk about David Ricardo's ideas today and the idea of comparative advantage, and talk a little bit about the concepts that students get confused a little bit here. And one is absolute versus comparative advantage. Absolute versus comparative advantage. So I want to run you through a couple little problems, easy little problems here to make sure we understand what's going on. We'll talk about absolute advantage first. And absolute advantage has to do with the amount of an input it takes to produce a good or service. And remember, our inputs are our factors of production: land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurial ability. And in our examples here, we'll just use labor, but you could use any one of these inputs and the same idea. You come to the same understanding of this idea. But we'll use labor for the moment. So here's a simple little problem. And in this problem we have two people. One's a certified public accountant and one's a painter. And the CPA needs her house painted and the painter needs to have his taxes done. And we want to understand how they should go about, who should do the painting and who should do the taxes, right? So if you notice here, the CPA in my little table takes 30 hours to do the painting and 2 hours to do the painter's taxes. And a painter, if the painter paints the CPA's house, it takes him 40 hours to do the painting and 10 hours to do his own taxes. So one thing we're going to notice here is that the CPA does both of these things faster. The CPA is more efficient, both at painting her house and doing the taxes of the painter. So we would say that the CPA has the absolute advantage in painting and in taxes because she can do it faster. And you might actually come to the conclusion that, well, since she's faster, she should do both things. And you would be wrong, according to David Ricardo. And that's what we want to show. Why is that the case? So notice that the CPA can have the absolute advantage in both things. The painter just does things in terms of the amount of labor much slower. So he's not as efficient. Let's look at another quick little problem here, and I'll expand on these two little problems as we go down. But here's another little problem. These are two college roommates. We've got Pat and Chris, and they like to make root beer and pizzas. And if you notice Pat here, again, our table shows how many hours it takes to produce each one of these goods. So Pat can produce 1 gallon of root beer in 4 hours, or a pizza in 2 hours. Chris, on the other hand, takes 6 hours to produce a gallon of root beer and 4 hours to produce a pizza. So once again, we would say Pat has the absolute advantage in the production of root beer and pizza because she does it faster, right? So you can have the absolute advantage in both goods, and we would say maybe Pat should produce both of them. And once again, we would be wrong. And so that's what we want to talk about. Why is this the wrong way of looking at who should produce these goods? And the idea, again, comes from David Ricardo. And his insight here is that it's not the correct way to look at this, and looking at inputs is not the correct way of looking at it. What you really need to look at is what you give up to produce that good. In other words, if you're fully employing all of your resources already, and that's the assumption we'll make for the moment anyway, if you're fully employing all of your resources, you exist on that production possibilities frontier like we've talked about in an earlier chapter. If you want to make more of one good, you have to give up some of the other good. So if you want to make more pizza, you have to give up some root beer. If you want to make more root beer, you have to quit making some pizzas. So what we're going to do is, this is obviously related to opportunity cost. So if I want to make more root beer, my opportunity cost is I have to give up the production of some pizza. So Ricardo said, listen, this is the way to look at it. We want to look at the opportunity cost of producing a good. So we'll assume that all of our resources are fully employed. And let's go back to this first example. And let's just take a quick look at the CPA and the painter. Who should do each one of these tasks? And we'll do this in terms of the opportunity cost. So here's the CPA. What is the CPA's opportunity cost of doing her own painting? Well, if she works those 30 hours to paint her house and then gives up doing taxes, she doesn't collect that $50 per hour. So that's 30 times 50. It really costs her $1,500 in terms of opportunity cost to do her own painting. If the painter does it, the painter takes longer. However, he only charges $15 an hour, so $600 is what it really costs her. So what should she do? She should really let the painter do the painting, because in terms of opportunity cost, it costs her more. How about the painter? Should he do his own taxes? And the answer again is no. If the painter does his own taxes, it takes him 10 hours. He's not very good at it. He gives up the opportunity to paint at $15 an hour, so his total cost, his opportunity cost here is $150. If the CPA does his taxes, she's very efficient. She takes 2 hours, charges him $50 an hour, and he only winds up paying $100. This is the way that Ricardo said we should look at it. We should look at this in terms of opportunity cost, not in terms of inputs, land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurial ability. So notice here, who should do the painting? The painter. Who should do the taxes? The CPA should do the taxes. If they do that and then trade, they'll both wind up being better off. This is what Ricardo tells us. Some of these problems, of course, become a little more complex. And the way I'm going to show you a little way to sort things out here, so you don't have to keep these opportunity costs all in your head. I can't do it in my head most of the time. Some of you probably can, and some of the numbers are easy enough. But some of the numbers are not so easy to remember in your head. So what I'm going to suggest you do is do something, what I call is create a little opportunity cost table so you can see it. And when you do this little table, everything else kind of flows from it. So let's go back to Pat and Chris, who are making the root beer and the pizza. And I've just reproduced this original table here. These are our inputs, hours of labor to produce root beer and pizza. But let's construct a little table that shows this, what the cost of root beer and pizza is in terms of the other good. Okay, let's look at the comparative advantage. So if we look at Pat first, to make a gallon of root beer, it takes her 4 hours. What could she be doing with those 4 hours? She could be making pizza. One pizza takes 2 hours, so really she could be making 2 pizzas, right? Let's look at Chris. To produce a gallon of root beer, Chris takes 6 hours. What could Chris be doing with those 6 hours? Chris could be producing a pizza. And in this case, it only takes 4 hours to produce a pizza for Chris, so Chris could produce 1.5 pizzas. And if you look at this in terms of pizza, what is the cost of a pizza in terms of beer? Well, for Pat, it takes, to produce a pizza, it takes 2 hours. What could she be doing with those 2 hours? She could be producing root beer, but it takes 4 hours to produce an entire gallon, so she could only produce a half a gallon of root beer in this case, okay? And Chris, to produce a pizza, takes her 4 hours to produce the pizza. What could she be doing with those 4 hours? Well, she could be making root beer, but in this case, it takes her 6 hours to produce the root beer, so she can only produce 2/3 of a gallon of root beer. Now, a couple things to notice here. One is that if you look at these columns here, notice that Pat produces a gallon of root beer, takes her 2 pizzas. To produce 1 pizza takes a half a gallon of root beer. 2 and 1/2 are reciprocals. 1/2 and 2/3 are reciprocals. All right, so if you get the numbers in one column, you always know what the numbers are in the other column because it's just the reciprocal of this number here. 2 is, again, is the reciprocal of 1/2. So now you can figure out who should produce the root beer and who should produce the pizza, because the cost now is in terms of the other good. So to produce a gallon of root beer, who does it the cheapest? And in this case, it's Chris does, because Chris only has to give up 1.5 pizzas to produce a root beer, whereas Pat has to give up 2 pizzas to produce a root beer. How about a pizza? Well, Pat only gives up a half a gallon of root beer to produce a pizza, but Chris has to give up 2/3 of a gallon of root beers. So the cheaper person here in terms of the other good is Pat. Pat can produce a pizza by only giving up a half a gallon of root beer. So notice that it's not this, it's impossible. It's not the same case as with absolute advantage. You cannot have the comparative advantage in both goods. It's the way the math works out here. Because these are reciprocals, it's impossible to have the comparative advantage in both goods. One is always going to have the comparative advantage in one good, and the other person or country will have the comparative advantage in the other good. There's only one case when this doesn't work out, and that would be the case where the trade-off is exactly the same. In other words, there's no difference in the trade-off between these two goods. The trade-off between root beer and pizza is the same. So, who should make the root beer? Chris should make the root beer. Who should make the pizzas? Pat should make the pizzas. So now we know that in terms of absolute advantage, it's not the case that Pat should make both. Actually, Pat should only make the pizza and Chris should make the root beer. And in this way, if they specialize in what they do best, ultimately they wind up being better off. They're able to live outside of that production possibilities frontier. So they wind up being better off by trading. So here's some things to note. You cannot have the comparative advantage in both goods. The opportunity cost of the other item is always the reciprocal. And by specializing in trading, Pat and Chris can live outside of those production possibilities frontiers. And that's illustrated, I won't do it here, but it's also illustrated in your book. So the other thing we want to talk about is this another term here called terms of trade. And what's going to happen is Pat and Chris are going to trade, right? And so the question is, well, if Pat makes the root beer, if Chris makes the root beer and Pat buys the root beer, at what rate will they trade? What are the terms they will trade at? And the answer to that is we don't know. We don't know exactly anyway, but we know a range in which they will trade. Once again, Chris is going to make the root beer because Chris does it cheaper. Chris, to produce a gallon of root beer, costs him 1.5 pizzas. So Chris would like to get something more than 1.5 pizzas, right? Pat produces a gallon of root beer at a price of 2 pizzas. So Pat would like to get the root beer for something less than 2 pizzas. So what are our terms of trade? The trade for root beer, then 1 gallon of root beer will trade for something in between 1.5 and 2 pizzas. So that we would say is the terms of trade here, okay? 1 gallon of root beer will trade for somewhere between 1.5 and 2 pizzas. Looking at it the other way, Pat is going to produce the pizza. She produces a pizza, it costs her 1/2 gallon of root beer, so she'd like to get something more than 1/2 gallon of root beer. Chris, on the other hand, can get a pizza for 2/3 of a gallon of root beer, but would like to get a pizza for something less than 2/3 of a gallon of root beer. So pizza is going to trade for something between 1/2 and 2/3 of a gallon of beer. So again, those are the terms of trade. We don't know exactly what it is. The terms of trade are a range of prices, and what they actually trade at will be up to them to decide, their negotiating ability and other external factors. So terms of trade then describe the price of a good in terms of the other good, and it's a range of prices. Okay, so I hope this helps you a little bit with some of these terms. Terms of trade, comparative advantage, and absolute advantage. Remember, absolute advantage is in terms of inputs, land, labor, capital, entrepreneurial ability, and comparative advantage is in terms of opportunity cost, the other good. How much does a good cost in terms of the other good? Okay, so I hope this little mini lecture helped you sort some things out, and we will see you in the next mini lecture. Bye bye.